On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the OECD predicts a global slowdown amid current trade tensions. Will the major economies heed their warning? And trade between China and Russia surges to $100 billion. What does this partnership mean for Asia as a whole?
And it's very important because we believe Russia-China has the best relationship ever.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin with a fresh economic outlook from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The OECD predicted in a new report Wednesday that the global economy will grow by 3.5% in the next 2 years. Take a look.
Global expansion has peaked and is likely to slow down over the next 2 years. Global GDP growth has settled at around 3.7 this year, but for 2019 and 2020, the OECD forecasts the global economic growth will drop to 3.5% due to a full-blown trade war and the resulting economic uncertainty. The OECD predicted that China's GDP would slow from 6.6% growth this year to 6.3% in 2019. The report said that China's trade growth has remained relatively strong while the government tries to maneuver in the face of higher U.S. tariffs. Meanwhile, the OECD said that China's service sector was expanding steadily, especially in the digital and sharing economies. In October, the IMF also released its global economic growth outlook for 2018 to 2019, setting the bar on 3.7%. It also warned the risk of a full-blown trade war between China and the U.S. On Thursday, China's Commerce Ministry said that mutual understanding between the Chinese and American leadership is still achievable. The Commerce Ministry said that China is evaluating the potential impact from the U.S. proposal to increase technology export control. The ministry said that China is deeply concerned about U.S.'s Section 301 report update, and China won't accept U.S.'s new groundless accusation. In the APEC meetings, leaders have failed to reach a joint communique. This lack of global consensus poses a challenge to the future of the world economy.
For more on the OECD forecast and the prospect of the world economy, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Zhang Gong, professor from the University of International Business and Economics. In London, we have Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute and co-director of the Durrandor Forum from the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Washington, Paulo von Schirach, president of Global Policy Institute. It's a public policy research institute. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen. Certainly, you are joining us from different corners of the world, and as a result, I hope we're going to have a fair conversation. Beginning from you, Mr. von Schirach, since you are based in Washington. The U.S. economy, according to OECD report, is still likely to grow strong, though there could be concerns felt by the consumers as a result of the so-called trade war.
Indeed. The American economy has done reasonably well at the beginning in the middle of 2018. Largely, this was due to the immediate impact and sort of euphoria subsequent to tax reform that was passed at the end of 2017, plus the optimism engendered by massive deregulation that has been ordered by the Trump administration. But certainly, as the global economy cools off, America cannot insulate itself from it. And as your reporting indicated, if we don't find a solution with this trade dispute with China,
right,
there will be ripple effects worldwide, which will eventually affect American prices and consumers, and therefore cool off the rather buoyant American economy.
Right. Professor Begg, though, if you think about 2 years, that's quite a number when it comes to Washington politics. 2 years means the next round of presidential election. So having said that, though, Professor Begg, it seems that no matter what the prediction is from the OECD, the problem is not going to fall before the next presidential election reaching its result. So would that mean anything for the U.S. administration to reconsider its current policy?
Well, I think we need to be rather cautious because the change in the forecasts put forward by the OECD and the different figures from the IMF mentioned in your opening package are not a severe recession. They are a moderate slowdown of the economy. What's much more important is the risks that things get worse because of the trade war. And that's where I think the real pressure will come on, not the current forecasts so much as the risks that if the trade war escalates and it has more than the ripple effects that Paolo just mentioned, then it will be damaging on the downside for the global economy. That will happen over the next 2 years because when you make a change in trade, it isn't instant in its effect on either the local or the global economy.
Right.
So I think it's watch this space rather than say it's something very imminent.
Right. Professor Begg, though, I want to follow up about that. You talk about the slowdown, but according to both OECD and IMF reports, it's very likely to be the rest of the world, not necessarily the United States, though. So that is the issue here. Professor Begg, once again.
Well, yes, and a global aggregate obviously is an average of very different parts of the world. We see difficulties arising in, for example, Latin America, South Africa. There's a relative slowdown in some of the core European countries recently, whereas China, we may say that even the 6% figure is still pretty high growth envisaged for China, and with the US at 3 to 4, it's still pulling the world economy. So I think you do need to look at the individual components of it rather than focus entirely on the aggregate.
Right. Professor Gong here in Beijing, your thought about all of these predictions about the future economy, whether it is the most developed economies such as the United States or emerging ones such as that of China, and also developing ones. The global economy as a whole, Professor Gong, from your perspective, knowing the realities of China.
I think these forecast adjustments are very much in line with a lot of people are predicting. For example, some time ago there was this also downward adjustment from the World Bank, very much in line, the same kind of a tone, same kind of messages. So I think the exact numbers might be a little bit different, but the overall message here is very clear that we, in the first place, we are nearing we're nearing the end of a very long boom cycle here. So there are certainly risks out there that the economy is going to take a downturn here. Second, on top of that, we have this very drastic policies from the United States government that are endangering the smooth economic performance, that it's going to cause a carnage, I think, in my opinion, for both economies, United States and China, and some other economies around the world, if we don't resolve this issue quickly. And I think there's still some political risk that it's not going to be resolved quickly.
Well, the APEC we have already seen, both the APEC CEO Summit and also the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting. I was there in PNG to cover the event, and the result was not necessarily a very encouraging one. Looking up to the G20, nobody knows what's likely to be the result of that one, developing from the APEC realities. Having said that, though, Professor Begg, the most important thing is not necessarily just the tariffs and the countermeasures toward the tariffs, but rather what is really behind this apparent trade war. It is much more than just the economic and trade. It's more about almost the ideology, more about value systems, and many others that we did not manage to mention with enough time in our program. So, Professor Begg, with the divide as big, as deep as that, is there any way to mend the fences?
Well, there are challenges to confront, and one is the perception in other parts of...
Enormous amount of challenges to confront. I have to correct you about that. Go ahead, Professor Begg.
Okay. Multiple challenges, but I think one that surfaced during the APEC meeting that you mentioned in PNG is that there is something of a pushback against Belt and Road, with countries like Australia and the United States coming together to say, wait a minute, there are some reservations we have about Belt and Road. Is this a form of almost imperialism by China, trying to take over the infrastructure, maybe landing countries with debt? And that's an ideological position which you see coming from what you might call the Anglo-Saxon world, if Australians will tolerate being called Anglo-Saxon. There's a separate one about whether state control is a sufficiently acceptable mode of governing the economy to many parts of the world. And we all know that the US pretends always to be in favor of markets, although a Trumpian approach is very much shaping the market in his image rather than the one that might be more suitable for South Asia or East Asia. So I think we certainly do see ideological elements in this. But it still comes back to the fundamental question, to what extent do you accept trade restrictions?
Right.
And until we know where Trump's really going with this, we can't be too certain.
Right. Professor Gong,
yeah,
China has been advocating, if you can, I would just put in a word here, advocating diversity. That was certainly reflected in the speech given by Chinese President Xi Jinping then at the APEC CEO Summit, right before the Vice President of Mike Pence of U.S. So, Professor Gong, can different kinds of economic system, political system coexist under the current circumstances, and what would that mean, or not?
Yeah, well, I was just
ahead.
about to say this. I think the ideological differences between the two development models, I think is a little bit overblown. I mean, look at the demands from the U.S. side contained in that Section 301 report. What are they trying to address here in terms of China's so-called distortion in trade practices? Well, forced technology transfer. This is something that China has already said we're not going to do this. Second, intellectual property rights protection. Well, this is something already said that we're not going to do. You know, we're going to enforce our protection of intellectual property rights. State subsidies. Well, I mean, there are state subsidies in the U.S. as well. And it's also something that we can scale back as well.
For example, right now.
I'll give you one example. I'll give you one example. Just recently, Amazon.com has announced the second headquarters. It got over $2 billion of incentive package from the state of New York and state of Virginia.
Right.
I mean, it's a huge amount of money. If this is not subsidy, what else is subsidy, right? Another issue is with respect to the industrial policy. You know, I think this is also something that China's side can make some concessions. So overall, I think, you know, if you look at the broad spectrum of issues that are raised by the United States side, I think, you know, not that much is really related to the core ideological difference between the Chinese economic model and American economic model.
Okay.
There's not much of a difference, in my opinion.
Mr. Von Schirach, your thoughts about this? One of the things the Chinese are quite confused about is exactly what Washington wants. Not just Washington wants, but what the White House wants. Well, if you ask the White House cannot explain in details either. So obviously there's a fight being picked up before they know how to wrap it up and what exactly is the nature of this fight. Mr. Von Schirach, you probably is much more of an insider than all of us. Help us to explain, please.
Well, it's a hard thing to explain. My office is 2 blocks from the White House, but I am not sure that I get, you know, the necessary intelligence as to what's happening in there among the close advisors to President Trump. And it is true that if one looks at different parts of the government, one hears slightly different, you know, tunes to this music. Certainly the office of the U.S. Trade Representative seems to be the most ideological, if you wish, in their belief, as we've been discussing so far, that China is not playing by the rules, that it is really trying to rewrite the rules, and that this behavior is not acceptable. But as we've been saying so far, to the extent that China can provide, and I think it has tried to do so, reassurances as to its basically, you know, intent and practice to abide by the rules, well, that argument kind of fails. In other words, I really think, if I may, that there is a real opportunity in the forthcoming meeting in Buenos Aires between President Trump and President Xi Jinping to get some kind of a breakthrough. Okay. I don't know that this is going to happen, but this is the kind of thing that Trump loves to do. To say, hey, look at that, look at me, I saved everything, I fixed everything, and my friend and colleague and respected leader Xi Jinping and I got together and sorted it all out. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it can.
But of course, when he turned around, he could also say other things. We wouldn't analyze the psychology of President Trump in this program. It's too little time to do that. But the focus is on the world economy. Therefore, let me go to you once again, Professor Beck, about that as well. The question really is whether we all need to feel enormous amount of pain before things begins to change. That is the danger hanging right in front of us. Of course, politics could go all their way, but the thing is the impact of politics on everybody. If the world's economy really slows down, given the complicated situation of ups and downs of the economic cycle, nobody knows whether all of these elements added together, what it would mean to our world economy. 2008, we experienced already a round of financial crisis. People already warned the crisis is going to happen more frequently than it used to be. And are we already digging our own holes for ourselves right now, Professor?
Well, in some respects, yes, because we know that in a number of countries, debt levels remain high. When interest rates are at extremely low levels, then that debt doesn't have much impact because the cost of servicing the debt is very limited. If interest rates normalize, and I notice in the OECD report they use the word appropriately to describe the withdrawal of liquidity, which is implicit in ending quantitative easing. A normalization of interest rates will put more pressure on debtors, and that can slow down the economy, and with a very high debt, it has the risk that it turns into a renewed financial crisis. I've played down that risk, and I know that Professor Gong and I have disagreed on this in the past, but nevertheless, I think that we should be aware of the risk and of other risks, of the impact on the European economy of what's going on, not just over Brexit, but the contest between Italy and the European Commission. These are things that can tweak the economy in the wrong direction, and we need to be alert to in examining them.
All right. Professor Gong, not necessarily for you to respond once again to what Professor Beck just said. He's already pointing out the differences between the two of you. I would rather you to help us to shine some light on a more complicated issue, which is about fiscal cooperation. In the OECD report, it warns about the general effort coming from different economies, developed, emerging, developing alike, about fiscal cooperation. What is there? And actually, what kinds of situation are we really facing right now?
I think the OECD is already talking about the worst case scenario, and they are predicting, I mean, they're
well,
preparing for
job.
the...
That's their job,
that's right. They're preparing for the worst, actually. So what they are saying is that we should plan for some kind of a coordinated effort for fiscal stimulus packages, basically. I think it's still early right now, but it can come down the road if we get into that kind of a situation.
Right.
So, so really, this is about coming up with some kind of stimulus packages, basically, projects that they can pump into the economy.
On the other hand, Professor Gong, it's been talking about tax cuts and also increasing of consumption could actually help the economy to overcome some of the latest challenges we have seen, which all of you have illustrated earlier. But the question is, the joint effort of these will be able to overcome at all the negative impact on our economy, which is mainly about confidence and unpredictability.
Right. So the confidence and the unpredictability really hurts investment. If there's no investment, it doesn't generate jobs, doesn't generate opportunities for the money to spend on consumption. So the question you are raising really is respect to whether the consumers have enough disposable income to increase their consumption. And let's talk about the situation in China. I think in China, still there's a lot of room for consumers to at least to digest some of the shock, if ever we're not going to reach any agreement with the United States, that we can somehow increase domestic consumption to resolve some of the reduced demand from the United States.
Well, what else can you do, right? You have to adjust
That's
and
right.
digest.
That's right.
In a way. Having said that, though, there's another very important issue, Mr. von Schirach. You have witnessed, Mr. von Schirach, over the past few months and probably even years, some of the emerging economies are aspiring to working together toward a new currency possibility. For example, the currency swap, which is taking place between China and Russia right now. 200 billion is not necessarily a big word when it comes to bilateral trade, but that is a starting point, that the two are willing to trade in their own currencies, RMB and ruble. And that is not alone. For example, China and some of the other emerging economies. So it is a starting point. Many others are suggesting, will this, in a way, bringing in new elements for discussion about the prospect of world economy? Mr. von Schirach.
Well, yes, that's definitely a possibility, but I think it's still a work in progress and a distant possibility regarding its impact on global finance and trade financing and what have you. For better or worse, the dollar is still the reserve currency and the currency in which most trade transactions are denominated, even though, you know, as you pointed out, there are efforts to find perhaps alternatives. But the reality is that the US dollar is still dominant. Then you have the euro or the Chinese or the Japanese yen and what have you. To me, the biggest problem right now regarding emerging countries is their very, very significant debt load and inability to find better recipes for growth. Brazil is a disaster. South Africa is a disaster. India, while it's growing, it's significantly, if one looks at GDP figures, the country is quite disorganized at multiple levels, extremely inefficient, and so it's kind of complicated. Therefore, the idea of finding alternatives in terms of means of payments and whatnot, while worth looking into, it seems to me a distant hypothesis.
All right. Talking about debt issue, the United States also have an enormous amount of debt issue and deficit issue as well, Professor Gong.
That's absolutely right. I mean, Michael Pence at the APEC speech talks about sea of debt. Well, we have an ocean of debt here back in the United States. This is absolutely true. I think you know, I'm trying to address the issue of accusing China being, you know, providing a debt trap to some of the Belt and Road Initiative affected countries. This is just this is just unfair, in my opinion. I think the way that Chinese companies do things are still very much in line with you know, pursuing interests for both sides. It's, you know, the theory is based on conspiracy theory, basically, that we're somehow entrapping these countries into a big debt and somehow swap this debt into equity investment and in a sense controlling the assets, the port assets and so on and so forth. And that's just a too much far-stretched conspiracy theory, in my opinion. You know, and it's very hard to believe.
Well, it seems that the world is changing, and the ways people are describing about each other has also been evolving. There's other harsh words likely to come up in the future. I guess we all have to be very much, you get used to it, but at the same time be able to talk the real nature about things. For now, I want to thank the three of you gentlemen for being with us. Really appreciate your insights from different perspectives. Zhang Gong, Ian Begg, Paulo von Schirach, thank you so much, gentlemen. Stay with us here on World Insight. Still to come on our program. Trade between China and Russia surges to more than $100 billion. What does this partnership mean for Asia and as a whole? Welcome back. You're still watching World Inside. I'm Tian Wei. The program coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. At this year's APEC Economic Leaders Meeting, a lack of a joint communique has brought global attention. Leaders of major countries have voiced their concerns. Chinese President Xi Jinping identified some challenges the world faces and criticized unilateralism. Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev also warns against the growing protectionism and advocated transparent rules on trade. The economic cooperation between China and Russia will be pivotal in reinvigorating the global growth. At the sidelines of the APEC meetings, I sat down with Kirill Dmitriev, who is CEO of Russia's Direct Investment Fund. He expressed his confidence in the economic synergy between China and Russia. The commitment of Russia and China in partnership in the region, how would you describe it to us when it comes to investment?
Well, I would describe it as very strategic, very deep, and with practical results already. And it's very important because we believe Russia-China has the best relationship ever right now, supported by our leadership. We are strategic in that we are investing jointly in infrastructure, in digital economy, and I'll mention our Alibaba investment, for example.
All right, I'll wait for those details.
So doing lots of great investments together, and this leads to better employment and growth prospects in Russia and in China. So I think it's really at the centerpiece of inclusive growth of APEC, and a very important example for other countries that sometimes are focused on protectionist measures instead of joint investment and joint trade.
Your Prime Minister, Mr. Medvedev, certainly been talking about openness and also connectedness. And he also talked about infrastructure building in the region. Of course, that's part of your job to provide funding for those infrastructure projects. But of course, there's always a balance that you need to look at. One is the debt as a result of the investment in the infrastructure. The other is the potential these infrastructure likely bring to economic boom. So what about that balance?
Sure. So first of all, 40% of our investment at Russian Direct Investment Fund are infrastructure investments. And we are very experienced in how to structure them. And we are doing some very interesting projects, including the first ever bridge between Russia and China that is going to cut ways for traffic by around 500 kilometers and is quite significant. And Russia is going to undertake a $100 billion infrastructure spending program right now. Lots of Chinese investors and companies can participate. And we are structuring it in such a way that if the return of the project is not enough, government would give some support and some capital grants to make sure that investors receive minimal return, and this is a sustainable, good return project. So this is very important to balance. We don't believe we should accumulate major debts on infrastructure projects. We believe that government should support it just enough so that investors can get good return, debt gets paid off, and it's a good sustainable infrastructure
So it
project.
is a PPP, public-private partnership in a way.
Which we believe is a way forward.
Of course, the Eurasian area is one that Russia has been focusing on, and the Prime Minister, in his speech at the APEC CEO Summit, has been focusing on that as well. But on the other hand, you got China's Belt and Road Initiative, which the Chinese President Xi Jinping said it's a very open initiative, welcome all the partners to join on that platform and develop things together. So once again, we seem to have parallel projects.
Yes.
How does that work?
Well, first of all, I think they will be connected, and that they are being connected, because lots of Eurasia Union infrastructure can be tied to Silk Road infrastructure.
I see.
And the bridge I mentioned is one example, but even our joint investment with Alibaba, we believe it's tying of Silk Road, digital Silk Road, with our market. And basically, Alibaba will retain 48%, Russian partners will have 52%. All of the data will be localized in Russia, but we will benefit from tremendous expertise and R&D of Alibaba all over the world. So it's an example of a solid, honest partnership to build the key company in the Eurasia Union, really tying also uranium Eurasian Union to China.
I see. So that's how it works in one direction. It will work the other direction as well when it comes to investment into the Chinese market.
Of course, and we've been investing in China market quite a bit through our Russia-China fund. For example, we invested in Didi Taxi. We invested in NIO, which is a great electrical car.
Yeah, good for
half
you.
the price of Tesla, just went IPO. We invested also in Megvii, which is a great artificial intelligence face recognition startup. So we invested in China as well, and really President Putin also focused quite a bit on joint technology and infrastructure cooperation between China and Russia. And he believes if we invest jointly a lot in technology, we really have those fundamental bridges and very strategic partnership going forward.
About the term transparency, there are already very different interpretations as to what is transparency and what transparency should be about. Particularly when it comes to the partnership between the government and private sector. From your perspective as an investor, what exactly is it to you?
Yeah, well, transparency, first of all, is very clear vision of financial result, even, I'm sorry to use this term, financial model. Because there are lots of projects being discussed on grand scheme, but it's very important to have financial transparency, to understand the rate return of this project, how is it being financed, and really be meticulous. Is it a loss-making, is it not loss-making? And this is very important because this allows us to focus and prioritize on the best infrastructure projects. And we've done analysis of 70 top infrastructure projects in Russia. We know effect of everyone on GDP. We know how much private money to bring. So that's financial transparency. Obviously, there is transparency of decision making. And that is very important, and frankly, predictability of decision making.
That's right.
And what we've seen that, over the last couple of years, that has been shattered in the world. So I think decision makers and leaders are expected to be sort of consistent and transparent in their messaging. And lots of changes and lots of inconsistencies create chaos.
Just to follow up about that, trade, of course, is one that requires a lot of transparency when it comes to decision making. But now we see the global debate about free trade. We also see some economies trying to, in a way, quote unquote, alter the global trade system, including about WTO. What to do with WTO? Russia, of course, recently joined. As a newcomer, what would you see how the system should be run? And how is that tied up to what you are doing, which is investing?
Sure. Well, WTO is absolutely critical platform, and its rules are being violated by many countries, and this is very bad for the world economy. And I think those countries underestimate the triggering effect. It's not only about US and China. It's about if China there is a little bit slowdown, it affects other Asian economies. And it really at the end will hurt the US. So being optimist, we are quite hopeful that WTO rules will be respected. We are hopeful that during G20 meeting in Argentina, there will be a positive resolution of some of the trade disputes, because otherwise the world economy can slow down dramatically. And frankly, the world very much depends on good Chinese economic growth, because it's one of the key engines of the economic growth for the world.
Talking about the WTO, you were there to do the introduction to your Prime Minister's speech at the APEC CEO Summit. And in his speech, he's talked WTO to maintain the current trade system, while at the same time to do improvements. And he specifically used one phrase I remember very clearly, civilized trade. And that certainly is a rule-based trade. About that, what about the rules? How will rules be updated and reformed? I'm sure from your side there are also some thoughts.
Yes. Well, Prime Minister Medvedev has really been a key driver of free trade of Russia with other nations, including with China. And you know, we have a $100 billion trade now with China. Nobody believed we would reach it. Prime Minister Medvedev just met with Li Keqiang recently and some other Chinese leaders, and he said, let's put a 200 billion goal for trade going forward.
Right.
And very important is that China is easing restrictions on some of our agricultural exports, etc. Because frankly, we have lots of good agricultural products that can be supplied to the fastly growing market of China. So we are also easing some restrictions and welcome Chinese partners and Chinese investors.
Like what? Like what?
Well,
the Chinese investor would love to know.
Yes. Well, for example, we have a number of Chinese companies invest in our energy projects, including a very strategic project in Yamal LNG, where CNPC is a participant. And it's a very strategic project for LNG production in Russia, huge reserves, and Chinese investors are there investing.
some different economies are trying to do it bilaterally. And with the economic power that they have and the size of the market, they try to set the rules and use those bilateral agreements as, quote-unquote, a model to develop multilateral trade mechanism. And as a result of certain pressure in different regions, some of the economy has to kowtow to that. And people see the danger of one size fits all. So what do you make of, if the system to be updated, what should they be about?
I think it will still be a combination of bilateral and multilateral, because to have absolutely unique, detailed rules for everyone is impossible. But I think it's about multilateral being more about principles and being more about really transparency we talked about, and eliminating barriers, and then some bilateral that really go into very deep specifics of each of the product lines, etc., that are important. And I think many people are trying to optimize for short term and try to squeeze another party to get short-term benefits, but it doesn't work long-term. And we believe that, frankly, all trade barriers have to be eventually removed, because that would allow for more efficient production, according to economic theory. And it just politicians who are frequently faced with elections, with short-term pressures, it's difficult for them to do this long-term.
Right.
But I think China and Russia, stable countries, can really set the tone, because they have slightly longer horizon in decision-making than many other countries that have to adjust every 3-4 years due to political cycles.
I see. You see geopolitics been evolving in this region, in the Asia-Pacific region. And as a result of that, businesses, even though they're still optimistic about the future, as they should be, are already having concerns, whether it's about trade war or the even military conflict in some of the sensitive areas of this region. How do you assess the current situation in the region?
Sure. Well, I just came back from Singapore, and I was with President Putin attending ASEAN meetings.
Yes.
And several very important themes came out from this. So first of all, one of the reasons why ASEAN and APEC countries are growing so much is because they learned to solve situations through discussion, and they really focused on avoiding wars and major confrontations. And this is one of the key reasons why you are growing so much faster than the rest of the world. And it's very important that it's kept. So Russia supports the process with North Korea and believes that there is good progress there, and it has to be two-way street, with North Korea also getting some concessions and getting some support. We support, our discussions with Japan, with whom we haven't had yet a peace treaty, but we are making good progress on investments, on economic cooperation, and on peace treaty discussions. So I think it's all about possible discussions and preserving this, core of the region of solving issues through discussion, focusing on economic growth, and enabling for economic growth for the world.
This area, the Asia-Pacific region, has been talking about FTAAP, Free Trade Area of Asia-Pacific. But that is a vision that economies, 21 of them, are all looking at. The question is, will the efficiency of discussion be able to catch up the need for that to be established and prosper? Your thought?
Well, we hope so. And we see, for example, that Singapore, which is a very open economy, is obviously doing quite well. And not having resources, not having many other things, it's doing tremendously well, precisely because it's open. And I think models like Singapore, models like, Transform China that we see, are good examples to the region to do eliminate trade barriers. And frankly, China may also do some, because I know there is some protection in the agricultural areas and in other areas. But I think as, internal market of China really has developed and is doing very well, and your consumption is growing dramatically, there is also an opportunity to release some trade barriers.
Yeah, I know many of the agricultural producers from Russia were present at CIIE, the first ever China International Import Expo.
Yes.
You heard about the Chinese president, $56 billion deal being signed during that fair alone. That's amazing. And next year there's going to be another one. I'm sure many of your colleagues and friends are going to go there.
Yeah, definitely. And first of all, there is already great progress because our chicken is now allowed to be sold to, to China. So that's first great progress. Secondly, we're an investor in a Russian company, Matryoshka, that is exclusive with Alibaba to sell Russian products into China market for medium and small size companies. And it's very important that they not only just sell it electronically, but they repackage it, they advertise it. So it's a very interesting model to increase export from Russia. So again, we believe China, Russia, working on free trade, investing jointly in Far East, working together is very important for our economies and for the world economy.
There seems to be a lot of debate about whether we're at a crossroad of history. That you see emerging economies, developing countries are just very eager to make their own decisions in collaboration with the others. But you also see a system that used to be established still functioning to a certain degree. So now here comes almost the tipping point. But when and how it would happen, nobody knows. From your perspective, as an investor, as a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, as a thinker about history, how do you see this interesting time and the interesting tide?
Yeah, I totally agree with you about tipping point, because we are at the tipping point of the change. And I think that is important for this tipping point. I think the world is not about dominating others. The world is about creating a platform for countries to cooperate, and I think Russia and China are doing that successfully, and other APEC economies are focusing on it more and more.
So you think there is a win-win situation? It's not just a political slogan?
Yes, we believe so, and you know, the world is showing that, you know, it's all about alliances, it's all about cooperation, and you win much more, as China has shown, as many other countries have shown, through cooperation.
Kirill Dmitriev from Russia. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on social platforms as well. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.